So my name is Marika Fisher-Hoyt, and I am the Artistic Director of Bach Around the Clock. And I am overjoyed that this session is happening. It is the culmination of many months of planning and visioning. And it arose out of the disturbance I felt last year. That was a year of very deep, ugly divisions being exposed in our country. And I could not figure out a way that I could contribute to healing those divisions or narrowing the divide. It just seemed like anything I would say on Facebook, any reasoned arguments, try to convince someone of my way of thinking, it just wouldn't work. It's like people were speaking different languages. Well, of course, there's the saying that music is the universal language, and I am a musician. And so I felt like it was my responsibility as a musician to see if I could use my art in any way that would make the situation better. And so when we came to plan this year's festival, I persuaded the board of directors to adopt as our theme, building bridges through Bach, because it seemed to me what this country and what the world desperately needed was bridge building. And so the way I know how to do that best is through music, and the focus of this festival is Bach. So that's where our theme came from, building bridges through Bach. And what did that mean? It meant it meant two things. One is using Bach's music as a bridge to different people with different experiences or different points of view, perspectives, but also trying to see if different populations or groups of people who didn't know about the joy of Bach's music could learn to appreciate it in different ways. So we've done a lot of outreach. We put together 2 in-house mini films. One was aimed at the tech novices. So that was how to film yourself, trying to get increased participation of performers in the festival. So if you didn't necessarily know how to do that, this was a way to reach that group of people. And another film we put together was Bach for kids. So the 10 and under set. Would they necessarily be able to appreciate Bach? Maybe not, but this film was an attempt to reach them. And we've been doing that in every which way. And as I was looking for other partnerships in this community, I just happened to look at the biography on the WPR website of my former colleague there, Jonathan Øverby. And this paragraph caught my eye. It says, Øverby's work is dedicated to the premise that people might better understand the human condition through varied traditions of sacred world music, which might have the potential for building bridges between diverse groups while illuminating and celebrating cultural diversity and the inclusion of marginalized groups. And it's like all sorts of bells went off in my head when I read that. I was like, there could be no person better aligned with the mission of this festival than this man. He's been all over the world, researching the role of sacred music in all different kinds of traditions and cultures. And he brings that wisdom and the perspective that he gains back to us in the United States so that we can try to widen our narrow perspectives. So that's what made me really want to reach out to him above all. So I called him, I contacted him, and he was interested. And it was the start of several really interesting conversations, which you're going to hear another in the series of tonight. Yeah, we had a lot of ideas to exchange. And it seemed obvious to the both of us that this would be an appropriate kind of partnership that would benefit both of us, the festival, the community. So we decided to pursue it. So I was overjoyed when Jonathan agreed to do that. And as the plan evolved, we decided that rather than it being a lecture where Jonathan is sharing his pearls of wisdom with the uninitiated, he felt more comfortable, and I feel like it's a good fit for the topic, as well, for it to be a conversation that will continue our conversation and trade ideas. And we would also like to include the viewers in that conversation. So you're all muted now, but there will be opportunities over the course of this session where we can entertain, where Jonathan can entertain the questions that you pose. So if in the course of Jonathan's and my conversation, questions occur to you, please write them in the chat. The chat box. If you're not sure how to do that, at the bottom of your screen, there's a little icon that says chat. And if you click on that, then the chat box will open up on the right, and then you can type questions in there and then people will see it. So if you have questions, please write that in the chat. And my beautiful daughter, Mara, is monitoring the chat and will collect the questions and deliver them to us. So at intervals, we can pause our conversation when we have reached a natural cadence, and then try to address some of the questions that you all have submitted for our consideration. So that's the setup. We are going to chat for probably, Jonathan and I will talk for maybe 10 minutes, then we'll pause for some questions, see if there are some. And then as he answers those questions, it may spark new directions for our conversation to go in. So we'll then chat some more and then take more questions. So that's the basic overall plan for this session. And we look forward to where it goes. So I will now turn the floor over to my esteemed former colleagues. So for those of you who don't know, I did work at Wisconsin Public Radio for 4 years, starting in 2012. That's when I first met Jonathan Øverby. And even after I resigned, our interesting conversations have continued, not least of all on stage, because we both play with Leotha Stanley's gospel carols. I didn't realize until then that Jonathan plays some nice percussion there. So yeah, so I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan now. And if you want a point of departure, you can take it in whatever direction you want, sir. But if you want a point of departure, I'm really interested. I'd love to go back to a topic that we touched on before, where you were talking about the musical traditions that one has been raised in and what one has a right to access or not. And it was in regards specifically to African-American gospel music, where you said that sometimes white people feel like they should not have the right to play or experience or create that music, but you had a different perspective on where that music is rooted and who has a right to it. Do you remember that conversation?
I do. I really do. And I can't wait to talk about it. But Mark, first, thank you for inviting me to be a part of your presentation this evening. I'm really honored and delighted to do that. And I also have to say, your introduction is very kind. Thank you. But one of my biggest learning moments was you actually talking about how to open up the chat room, which was really informative. It was great just to see how that's done when I'm on family calls, and I struggle with that. Thank you. Very, very, very helpful. Well, to begin tonight with the question that you pose is one that I pondered, and I've actually, wrestled with it for many years. And that is this idea of certain styles of music being exclusively owned by a particular culture. There is the idea of authorship, which can be authenticated. But we were talking about the role of the first form, as I see it, of American music, which is the Afrocentric spiritual. Now, there's arguments to be made about what elements go into the creation of that piece of music. And one of those arguments is that the spiritual that exists in this country today and grew out of the experience of those enslaved didn't happen in isolation. This is kind of a thumbnail sketch of the scenario, if you will. Those enslaved were not allowed in some cases to go inside the parishes on southern plantations, but they could sit outside, or in parishes in the South. They could sit outside because one of the issues was to Christianize the heathens and make them more malleable, if you will, to control. That's one of the sidebar challenges with that whole proselytization of those enslaved. But they would sit outside and hear this hymnody, which is consistent with some of the hymnody that they heard in Africa. And over the course of many generations, would take what they heard, these Eurocentric strophic hymns, and embrace them and add their own nuances to them to create their own musical story. And that is a powerful canon of music, largely created by unknown bards, people who we will never know the names of. In the midst of that historical challenge or tragedy, if you will, there's a part of this that allows all of us, particularly white folks, to embrace the creation as part of their own, put their own signature on it and be part of that. And that is that what those enslaved folks heard was Eurocentric inside the building. And they heard what they heard from the outside, embraced it, and created a genre of music that is both Afrocentric and Eurocentric. And so it means to me that you can actually not only listen to it, but present it and identify with it as a part of Eurocentric white culture, if you will, in a really raw kind of way. And I think that is a wonderful thing to be able to articulate, to be able to ponder, to be able to actually, with the theme of building bridges, to make that connection, to go across that bridge and to actually feel a sense of connectedness with African Americans who created this music by and large. But white folks can have a hand in celebrating it and performing it and being a part of not just being in the audience, but embracing it and digesting it. Just as opera singers from different cultural backgrounds can go to Europe and sing at the Met and be in all these wonderful settings where they can perform opera, but they don't have to look like the original performers of that music. It's the authenticity of the presentation, in addition to being empathetic with who created that music and where it was created, that really connects both sides of the bridge. And that is a point of celebration.
So that's making me think of my obsession with Hamilton, which was striking in that it was taking the story of the founding fathers and the birth of the nation and having many actors and singers and dancers of color on stage portraying George Washington and Aaron Burr, et cetera, and how powerful that was. I mean, it was powerful for whites and Blacks watching that being portrayed. Would you speak to that?
Well, I can say that I was in Chicago when the group, when Hamilton was touring, and my wife and I had the last seats in the back row in the balcony. It was, if I put my thumb up, that was as big as the cast was on stage. It was a marvelous presentation, and it speaks to the story of what human understanding of each other, our increased understanding of each other, and the fact that we can take old stories and give them a facelift. We can reinterpret them. We can actually inform each other through looking at what was considered a single pathway and recognize that the bridge has two lanes, and those lanes go in different directions. And sometimes people are traveling on the same, in the same lane going in different directions. You know, you can have retrograde inversion, if you will, of how people embrace the idea of what music represents and what culture represents and what history represents. And so one can't say that it's all valid, every single interpretation, but you have an obligation to listen to it and to see if there is a thread of universalism in it, in which you can see yourself and to see how other people see the world. And that's one of the most powerful things about music, as Longfellow suggested, that it's a universal language. And we can argue or discuss, if you will, what language actually is. It's more than just spoken words. There is a science to it that I think is key to delve into.
Well, now you're making me think of another application of this concept, which is the whole question of, do we, when we're playing Bach or singing Bach, it's not so much an issue with singers, but for us instrumentalists, there's the whole, you know, school of thought of trying to approximate as closely as possible how Bach created that music, heard that music, you know, 1 and a part, 2 and a part, original instruments, gut strings. You know, I'm an adherent of both of them. I've, as people know, I play Baroque viola, and I love playing early music on early instruments with people who have been trained in that language. But I'm also a complete fan of saxophone quartets who want to play Bis du bei mir, for instance. If you're talking about authenticity, they're equally authentic, because they're taking the music has joy baked into it, whether you're playing it on sax or a period viola with gut strings.
Aside from saxophones rendering a song about death, we can move that aside for just a minute and just celebrate that they have some affinity for that art song. One of the things that I think is exciting about Bach, he is my second favorite composer. Brahms is my first, and there's a long story associated with that. Okay. It's that there's this mathematical approach to performing Bach, and it has some consistencies with other forms of music, particularly jazz, which is very scientific. And it is one of the reasons why I actually have a great love affair with the music of Bach. I mean, after all, he had some jazz in him a little bit. He was a Lutheran, went from Lutheranism to Catholicism. So that means he had some ability to adjust as he moved through life and made certain decisions about how he would perform or create music. And it is one of the reasons why I think so many jazz musicians find an affinity with his compositions and reinterpret them because of the consistency of the percussive underpinning that you can play with and give it different textures and even speed and tempo, and still retain the identity of Bach's composition. And you can hear it. Oh, that's a Congolese rumba version or a Latin flavored percussive piece. And yet you hear Bach's signature sound within it all. For example, the Swingle Singers, if you will, with their take on it and using, you know, syllables that don't make any sense, but making it really cool to listen to. And the other thing, you are informing new audiences or giving them a chance to consider embracing a music that they may not totally be familiar with, but because it's rendered in a cool, if you will, context, that it could be alluring for them to go and want to taste it. And then if the taste leads to a fuller meal, it can actually become something where they not only have an understanding, but they have an empathy for what the music does based upon the theme, is to build bridges across cultural lines.
And they may understand it more deeply in some ways than someone who doesn't know how to improvise. I mean, Bach was, what we have now is his written music, but he was known in his own time as the performer and organ builder, and he was improvising. I mean, that's how the musical offering came into being. He was given the theme and he improvised a 6-part fugue on it, or no, a 6-voice fugue. Yeah, he was the great improviser. But of course, we don't have any access to what he did because they didn't have recordings. But yes, that side of him is more closely aligned with jazz musicians than we will ever really be able to spell out. But if a jazz musician has a deep understanding of what it means to improvise, then that musician will understand Bach in that way more than I will, because I don't improvise musically.
Well, but there are other elements, Marka. For example, there is a construct that allows for both improv and also a consistency of the rhythmic pattern, so that around that nucleus, you can have all kinds of things going on. Tempos that are counter tempos, 2 against 3, you know, all those kinds of things, people doing syncopated things. And yet the core, the fabric of his creation remains the same. And what people can pick up on, if they don't understand the core, is the cursory things going on around the primary aspect of the composition. And so if they hear that and go, I'm hearing a salsa tempo within a Bach composition. Now, I don't know who Bach is, but I recognize the salsa piece or the rumba or the mambo in it, or they went from doing a straight ahead mambo piece and now they're back to the Bach piece. And I'm picking up on some of my own experiences culturally, and it's drawing me in to want to explore, like so many Eurocentric composers did, to look at what something they didn't know. They wanted to look at it, to taste it, to actually ingest it, live it, sleep it, eat it, write it down, because they identified with the message of the music. You know, Antonin Dvorak, when he was asked to come to head the university, let's see, it was the New York School of Music, I believe, Conservatory of Music. I think that's roughly the name of it. He was there as the head of the school, and he heard Harry T. Burleigh in a practice room, the African-American arranger and composer. He arranged many spirituals. And he heard this motif, and he wanted to know what it was. He was intrigued by what he heard, this mournful quality, and Burleigh was practicing a spiritual. They built a bridge with each other, to the chagrin of Antonin Dvorak's eldest son, another story. And in the New World Symphony, you hear the motif, da 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 dee da 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 dee da 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 dee da da, and it was going home. So Dvorak actually was very proud initially to say that he had gleaned from his experience with Harry T. Burleigh in that practice room an appreciation for another form of music that he had never heard. And there again, you have that bridge building, that connection, that sense of dual ownership that comes from two different worlds in terms of their makeup, their construct in terms of music. And yet they gave joy to people. The New World Symphony, one of my favorite works because of, in large part, that motif. So all of this is out here, and we've stayed in our lanes far too long and afraid to cross the bridge, if you will, to the place of unknown. We always, classically trained musicians, raise my hand, we're not so comfortable with going places that we haven't been before. And because we're used to what we're used to. And sometimes it's not about the cultural makeup of the piece, it's getting outside of the basic rhythm of, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 and 3 being strong, and then another, it's 2 and 4, all that. Some of that even still trips people up because it doesn't sound consistent with their musical experience. And so they struggle with it, playing it, feeling it, playing against what they consider to be a standard rhythm. However, in other cultures, that rhythm is a standard. And Eurocentric music is not the litmus test for what is good and what is bad. It has been portrayed as that. Now, not by me. Let me rephrase. Okay. In far too many circles, from my viewpoint, it seems to be the case. I fudged on that a little bit just to be kind, if you will. Eurocentric music, by comparison to Hindustani classical music, there's some real issues about, like, the complexity of the two. Are there other forms of music, like gospel singers who use some of the same vocal approaches that operatic singers do? Is there a parallel there? Can we see ourselves cross-pollinating each other's center, if you will, musically, and finding that we can embrace it, we can explore, we can find our voice in someone else's work, someone else's cultural experience. And even if we don't agree with it, at least I think it's important to have a musical affinity for it, from the standpoint of recognizing that there are commonalities in it all. And beautiful music is beautiful music. And just because I don't understand it doesn't mean it doesn't have significant value to the community from which it came.
All right, my head is exploding many ideas. As always, I'm not sure which one. I'm going to say all three of them, and then you can choose which one you pick up on. One is just talking like you were saying that gospel music is a fusion of Afro roots and Eurocentric roots. It seems like Leotha Stanley here in Madison is creating something like that with his gospel carols, which is what we do. He's creating a sort of new genre of where the gospel choir meets the Madison Symphony, and we make music together every year. So that's one thought. Another thought I have is talking about embracing music or a culture different from your own roots and your own background. I'm thinking of, I know a little bit of Chinese music, just from music, when I played the Chinese New Year, I would always try to play music from that culture. And I know it's quite different from Western classical music. And yet, there are many, it seems like China has embraced Western classical music. And now if you look at the makeup of US orchestras, there are many Asian, Chinese, Korean players. This is not the roots of Western European classical music in Eastern countries don't go back that far compared to the roots of those cultures, for Pete's sake. And yet they have embraced that culture and excelled at it and brought new depth to they improved the culture that they found. And then my third idea is, my favorite movie is called Being John Malkovich, and it involves they discover a portal that they can go into John Malkovich's head, and they experience life through his eyes. And I'm thinking about a quote from another conversation we had where you said, music is the most powerful way to express cultural experiences. And I'm thinking, if we're talking about exploring and expanding your horizons, whereby you try out the music from another culture, is it the equivalent of going inside, someone else's head and seeing the world from their perspective? Those are my three current ideas.
All right, I don't remember any of them, but I'm going to try and pick up on a point that you made.
Okay.
And those are profound questions.
Oh yeah. That's me.
Travel broadens the mind.
Yes.
But you can travel through different mediums, if you will. You can open a page, a songbook, and thumb through it and find which of the pieces, that you connect with. If it's a ballad, you look at the tempo, the sentiment of the piece. And you may find, when you do that with songbooks, just as one example, from another culture, that you might see your experience in it. For example, what's the number one topic that most music is written about? Well, there's two. There's sacred stuff, religious stuff, spiritual stuff, but love. So a song about love, like the Japanese song Sakura. I did a concert some years ago, many moons. It was after Abraham Lincoln was no longer president, but it was long time ago, with a Japanese singer, a friend from Japan. And so she did spirituals, and I did Japanese art songs. And together, we did some duets from Porgy and Bess. And the look of us doing these, what we did, and set aside the quality of our performance for a moment, was the courage of my friend to actually want to try and sing those songs. And she sold them. She sold them because she could see, and she lived in the moment. And she would ask, is it okay? I've never experienced this before. Am I embellishing this right? Do I have the mood? Do I have the feel? And, I'm struggling with saying, speaking Japanese correctly was one thing. And then getting the simplicity of this particular art song down well enough so I could sing it as though those in the audience who happen to be Japanese could identify with it. So it's sincerity, authenticity, doing your homework, learning all the notes, in other words, getting the phrasing down and the spirit behind the piece gives you that scholarship. But then you get on a stage and you say, I'm going to give this the best that I can, because a part of me resonates with the spirit of this particular piece. And in that piece of music, you may find some of humanity's most deeply held sentiments related to that particular culture. And so from identifying with that culture and embracing it from your own place and your own experience, I think it's a wonderful, welcoming experience for those who not only want to look beyond their own musical horizons, but it's also very hospitable. It's very welcoming to someone who comes from another place in the world and they don't see or hear their experience in the fabric of American music through the making of music in this country to the degree that they experienced at home. And so you can build a bridge. You build many bridges. And within that expression, you open a window to creating good community with that group. And those tentacles last a long, long time. And they eradicate, though it doesn't erase, let me rephrase, it can reduce our misunderstanding. It can reduce our the sense of hatred that permeates far too much of the character of our nation right now, and in fact, the world. And we give the stranger that treatment that is required by every major religious tradition in the world. Every single one. Hinduism, the Holy Quran, the Torah in Judaism, in Buddhism, Catholicism, Christianity, is that we are to treat the stranger with a welcoming attitude. And it's not just, if you feel like doing it, go ahead and treat them well. It is a directive in every one of those. And so we fail on so many, on such a sweeping plane about living up to that particular call to be in good service, to treat the stranger as though they were a sister, and to embrace them, and to treat them as though they are part of our family. And musically, when we can get to that, we can get beyond the isolationist perspective of the good stuff happens in this hour on radio or at a performance, and then the other stuff happens on another kind of plane. We miss out on what building good community, in my view, is all about.
That reminds me of, like, when you think about people who go to church and see, the sermon that says do this and that and the other, and they're like, oh yes, but then they think that in church, but as soon as they set foot out the door, yeah. Anyway, well, I'm wondering, so we've been talking now for half an hour, and I'm wondering if this would be a good time to break for a couple of questions. Let's see, there is one in the chat that I see, and this is from someone here in Madison, Janet Murphy, who is on our board. And she says, hello, Jonathan. If you were to perform at Bach Around the Clock someday, what piece would you choose, and would you sing, play the congas, jazz it up, strictly classical? Your old friend, Janet Murphy.
Well, hi, Janet. Been a long time. Good to connect with you. Well, gee, she left out a key word, which really allows me to escape giving a fair answer. And that is that if it were a solo, I'm not sure what I would do. If it was an instrumental piece and it had a Latin texture to it, I would fit in as best I could. If it was a jazz piece in some way vocally, something in which there was an interpretation that had a Bach-like structure to it, but had some jazz elements, some doo-wop, some scatting or something, I would give that a taste, if you will. However, there is just something straight up about performing music written by the composer with their signature on it that isn't messed with. There is a beauty to that, doing it in its original framework. So that's a hedgy or kind of edgy answer to the question, but it depends. If anything, I would love to listen. The organ is a magnificent instrument that we don't get enough. We don't hear it enough. And in my travels to Europe, to hear some of these grand organs, which you feel, it's just, I was in Edinburgh, Scotland, this organ was like a city within the actual space. and to hear these pipes just billowing wonderful pieces, and you know, the Brandenburg material is just really over the top, and it takes you to another place because you hear the greatness of this music. And imagine being back in time to have heard it as it was originally presented. Is just a fascinating intellectual artistic journey to try to connect with.
There you go. Well, I hope that was, I'm looking at Janet on my screen. Hope that answer did it for you. All right. I think that's the only question for now. So I'm going to plunge right back in because you mentioned the magic word Brandenburg. And that's also a sort of centerpiece of the theme for this year's festival in my mind, because I see the Brandenburgs as bridges to Bach in several ways. For many people, that's the first Bach that they hear. It's probably not the first Bach that they perform. Usually, if you're learning an instrument, you're playing da 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 da, da, you know, like that. Brandenburg is a bit of a stretch, but if you're just listening, often Brandenburgs are the first Bach that you hear, and it's accessible music. It's pleasant, it's bouncy, it's easy to relate to. So it's like the entry level drug, so to speak, of Bach. But I also feel like Brandenburg concertos fit the theme of this festival for another, maybe even deeper reason, which is that Bach uses them, he uses the scoring in them to elevate and celebrate marginalized voices. And I'm talking about marginalized instrumental voices, of which I am one as a violist, obviously. So there were the stars of the show then as now. Violins were the showstoppers, maybe oboe, violas da gamba were the flashy soloists. But when Bach went to write his Brandenburg concertos, he did assign solo to violin in Brandenburg 2, but he also made it a point to afford soloistic opportunities to instruments that had never before had them, such as the harpsichord. So that's very famous in Brandenburg 5. I mean, the solo instruments are tootling along and all of a sudden everyone drops out. It's kind of like Haydn's Farewell Symphony, except it's in the middle of the movement. Everyone stops playing except the harpsichord for this extended cadenza. Had never happened before. And the same thing in Brandenburg 6, where you have violas who are typically, you know, also ran background, let's just play some chords. Now they're the virtuosic soloists, and the cello also, which had only been covering the continuo, and the stars of the show, the violas da gamba, were accompanying viola and cello, and violins weren't even there. So I feel like Bach was sending a message, sending a very clear message to the people of his time and to the universe, or he didn't really think of posterity, but I feel like he was sending a message that all voices count, and that you can't just discount someone's voice because they are in the shape that you think of as accompaniment or whatever. So, all right, speak to that.
Well, no, you raised this wonderful opportunity for me to chime in with your thoughts on Bach. I mean, he had his favorite instrument, the lute harpsichord, and this kind of experimentalist, improvisationalist approach that he took that was unique. There lies the idea of jazz, is moving something to the forefront that hadn't been there before, which defies both kind of what people expect, but he had the artistic sensibility to try something different. And he you know, I don't know what his life was like studying under his father. What was it, Ambrosius or something? I forget the exact name.
That's right.
Yeah. But during that time, that had to have some imprint on his music making. I mean, he was, you know, didn't he spend some time in Italy, I think? And I'm just never, no,
he never went to Italy. I don't think he ever left Germany, and his parents,
he never left Germany. Well,
yeah.
I may have mixed my Lutheranism with Catholicism.
Yeah.
Forgive me. Stuff kind of blends in sometimes. But he had a sense of a purpose in using instruments the way that he did, and they were innovative. I can imagine not knowing that people may have wondered why he did that. He was awfully busy making music for, in a church setting. So could it have been boring to continue to do the same thing, time after time, Sunday after Sunday, or whenever there was and so he was creative. And I think that is a beautiful thing to embrace as a cursory way of being a jazz artist, to take something that exists or how something was used and to use it in a complete different light. And I think that's a celebration. And it also says that he's on the cutting edge of being an innovator. And he was conscious of content and form, and how certain forms may have been frowned upon. And maybe people even questioned why certain instruments didn't remain, as part of the ensemble. So he gave authorship to the range of being able to try different things. I'm hoping you agree with that. And that gives him this place of great honor. I'm just going to grab a sip here.
Yeah.
Pardon me.
Yeah.
And it's part of the human condition. There's always somebody who comes along and says, I'm going to play the saxophone from the other end. And someone goes, what? And that person becomes a virtuoso. We have this whole new approach to how we look at how an instrument is to be used, how we interpret it, and how we raise certain instruments to a place of elegance, because someone did it first, and then it becomes the fabric of how music is created. It's another chapter in the entire story of music making. And over the course of time, we found that more and more Bach, as I recall, is being embraced by different traditions. I was in Cuba. I had the good fortune of going to Cuba, Marika. I've been going for a number of years. And I was in Cuba, in La Habana, Cuba, at their Conservatory of Music, and there were students from Uganda. Now, there's a political connection with Uganda, which we don't need to delve off into, but these Ugandan students were there in Cuba to study opera. And I happened to be at the conservatory the day that they gave their recital. And of course, I'm very used to it because I grew up in that environment here in the US. But to see these students from Africa, from Uganda, singing Italian arias was spectacular. And to try and do it with authenticity and a sense of embracing all of the vocal embellishments, the cadenzas, the portamentos, all of the, trying to sing as softly as they could and then as dramatically as they could, and stage presence, which is not characteristic of all forms of African music. Opera is not a signature to that particular continent. But it was a beautiful experience because you could see that they wanted to learn the craft and to do it with as much authenticity as they could. And it was really quite a treat.
Yay. Well, yeah, I just wanted to respond to your point about Bach, his innovations. I mean, he was seen in his time as they called him the old Whig, because he was sticking with counterpoint, Baroque counterpoint. He was not adapting to the new galant style. But he did push conditions. I mean, for instance, his settings of chorales, he got into trouble all the time because his settings were not homophonic, which means everyone says the same syllables at the same time. That's how you set up text. If that's the most important thing is the text, and the music is sort of secondary. But with Bach, of course, that's not the case. So his contrapuntal texture means that not only is the text harder to hear because everyone's saying it in their own line, but it means each line is really interesting of itself. So it's like he's giving each line its own interest in life, and yet they all line up at points in the bar, to form these chords together. So to me, that's brilliant, the way his chorale settings. Yeah, so that's just what I was thinking about. As far as whether he was an innovator or whether he was a fuddy-duddy, I mean, he was both. But he did try, he never left Germany, but he did try to expose himself to as wide a range of music as he could. He was, for instance, he walked, when he was 20 years old, he walked 250 miles from Arnstadt to Lübeck so that he could study with Buxtehude and learn from the great master and learn that Northern German style. He was from central Eastern Germany. Yeah. Anyway, he really did try to expose himself, and he wrote in French Baroque and he wrote in Italian style. So he was as cosmopolitan as he could be, never having left Germany.
Well, here's this thing that you kick up for me, Mark, and that is that the uncommon practice approach to music, the uncommon practice approach, is yet to be explored fully, in my view, with musicians who have become experts in their area of performance, their instrument, their theoretical approach to what music is all about. It's that uncommon practice that I think allows us to grow our experiences to a place of something greater than what we are as an expert. Because that uncommon space is where you'll find other things transpiring, or other things taking place. And in that space, you can learn, you can become that musicologist, that ethnomusicologist that says, I'm going to step out of what is familiar and look at what is unfamiliar, the uncommon stuff that I hear in music, as a pathway to increasing my sense of what music represents on a much bigger scale. So to be the great violinist or the great pianist or the great opera singer is notable. It's fantastic. It's a great piece of one's pedigree to say, I live my life as an artist in this area, and I performed it to the best of my ability. And I can look back over my entire life and say what a gift I had, and I used that gift to make the world a better place. There's still another level, and that is the obligation, the onus to practice sustaining traditions that are not just the ones that you're familiar with. Certainly taking your art and sharing it with a diverse community is certainly a gift. But embracing that community's music into what you do is another story. And it's part of what practitioners in music could do a better job at, in my view. And that's why my experience with traveling, researching music, has been a humbling experience. I share with you, and if you don't mind repeating this story of being in Africa.
Oh boy, here we go.
Tanzania. And I'm in a village with a Maasai tribe, and I was a guest, and the chief gave me a tour of the area. And the chief says to me, very crisp English, along with speaking Kiswahili. And he said, do you see those two hills off into the distance? In the distance? And I said, well, yes, I see them. And he said to me, what do they remind you of? And these two hills, symmetrically next to each other, they, in my mind, I said to myself, they look like a woman's breast, the breast of a woman. And I said, but don't you dare say that. I'm talking, I'm just, this is all split-second stuff. And I said, I'm not going to, I said, that would just be rude. Don't ever. And then he says, they look like women's breasts, don't they? And I said, really? I never would have thought of that. And then a moment turned into a movement for me right then.
You're quoting him.
And he said, the women of the Maasai Lodge, look at that hill, those two symmetrically shaped hills, almost identical. And it reminds them daily that they are givers of life. And the Maasai are, in many ways, they're an agrarian society, farmers and that kind of thing. And I was I was so taken. It blew my research that I had done. You know, my dissertation on world music was child's play after that moment, because I realized I couldn't make a determination ever again about the value of a particular expression based upon the lens that I'm looking at it through, be it a composition. I need to hear what some of those who have presented that composition before see, how they see it, or to see the relationship that someone has with that particular composition and that composition's underpinning, why it was created. I got to go as deep as I can and ingest it in order to give it the best presentation, to understand that culture. Even if I don't agree or like the piece of music or like that particular, all the aspects of that culture, it's incumbent upon me to go and explore, to take it that far. And then he said to me, he said, do you see those ridges going up to the top of the hills? I said, yeah. He said, the women in the Maasai Lodge create their traditional attire with ribbons that go all the way from the hem of their garments all the way up to the top to connect with those places on the trails. And you can see the trails off in the distance and people walking up there of their connectedness with the land. And so music is so much more than just performance. It's so much more than just a stylistic or cultural representation of who we are or who the authors are, the people performing. It is a part of universalism, the universalisms that draw us together, that say there are common aspects that unite us. There are common aspects to what we do that we can celebrate. There is a womanistic aspect to all of this, the givers of life, and that music is a part of sustaining that life through the expression of what has been born. So the time that we spend with music, not performing it, but having it close, and we're thinking about it and looking at it from what it represents for that community, is equally as important as when we get on stage and we present it, because that is when we actually serve it. We say, aha, I've tasted your musical experience, and I want to serve you the dish myself, that hopefully you find some elements of it that you can identify with.
I need to put a pause right now. Someone needs to leave and they are burning to hear your answer to a question. So if we can take a small break, I will bring you this question. It's again from someone in Madison, and the question is as follows. It feels that Bach's music can be played by different ensembles and can result in totally different feel to the music. It is almost that his music is plastic. Could he have intended this aspect of his music? I play his E-flat major flute concerto on tenor sax with piano, which seems to produce a totally different feeling than flute and harpsichord. Is that crazy? Did he intend it to be plastic? I mean, I have a thought about that already, but let me hear what you say.
Well, I'm not sure what the word I knew, going to school on the West Coast, they said people out there always have plastic personalities, and I was out there, and
that's not what it means here.
Yeah, and I always took offense to that, even though I'm from Wisconsin originally. Sometimes we have to be the best champion of what we do musically, and to be comfortable in what we do, and to be solid in it, even if it doesn't take hold right away, or if someone else gives it a critique that says it doesn't measure up to some kind of standard. If you're going to try non-traditional instruments with a composition that people have come to expect to be played with a certain instrument, or in a certain setting, or in a certain stylistic approach, then when you step out of that, you have the right to defend it. People have a right to critique it. Duke Ellington said there's only two kinds of music, good and bad. That's a limited kind of approach to analyzing music, because some of it can be so-so. But to the question, and I may be getting it wrong to process it this way. If you tried it and you wanted to experiment with it, it's a good thing. It's a good thing to explore and discover the possibilities of what can take place. I mean, Hamilton is an example of a scientific experiment that just happened to catch on. I don't know how many more pieces like that people would relate to, but this one was so well done, scholastically, historically, in terms of the staging, in terms of the costumes, the choreography, the singing, and the interaction and using, of all things, hip hop or rap or spoken word, which by the way, is the single most popular expression of art in the world today, in every country, rap. Because you don't need an instrument to create it. And I'm not sure it's actually musical, but we're going to leave that alone. It is rhythmic. That's, it is an art form. It's interesting to see these things taking place. And so I think we can celebrate Bach's, his desire, his courage to step out of what was the case traditionally and put some other players out in the spotlight. And people may not follow that particular form of music, but that's okay, because Thelonious Monk didn't have the same following as Satchmo, as Louis Armstrong. And were they good? Oh, yeah. And can I appreciate both? Yeah. Do I understand one better than the other? Yes, but don't tell anybody, because my dad owned a jazz nightclub in Milwaukee, and I want to actually keep his memory going well, that I do, but I don't. I was trained in a Eurocentric classical framework. And so I had to undo that particular approach to how I looked at things. And so that I could see that composers that I loved and wanted to perform, I needed to have them in the same cachet with spirituals, with art songs, with songs that were from other traditions. And so when I was performing broadly and traveling as an artist, concert artist, I made sure I did that. And so I say to the person who sent the question, enjoy what you're doing, celebrate it, keep doing it, because you may find someone who hears what you do and they take a portion of what you're doing and try to take it somewhere else. And they find a home in that particular expression as a part of music making for them.
I hope it was Martha. Yeah, and to Martha, I would add that just as a instrumentalist, I feel like the way Bach writes for certain instruments is very idiomatic for that instrument, but in other instances, in many cases, I feel like his writing is generic. He himself was constantly reusing different musics for different other instruments. He would adapt violin concertos for harpsichord concertos and oboe for flute. And I mean, he was constantly doing that. And I think it works because I feel like his music is more purely about the line unto itself and the texture of the music, not so much as writing it idiomatically for that instrument. And I think that's why it translates so well. It's more abstract and pure musically, not as tailored to the limitations, pros and cons of a given. Not that he didn't, I mean, he wrote really well for oboe, for instance. In the cantatas, he's able to make oboes blend and augment the voice in a beautiful harmonic way. But I feel like he is not, for instance, as idiomatic in his writing for instruments as Brahms and many other composers. So
I would add to that, Marka, that I used the word, forgot the word you used. Perfect. Did you say it was perfect in some way? Maybe you didn't say that. Whatever word you used, I was thinking that it is precise. His music is very predictable, and that's very steady, because when you have something predictable in a music composition, it's easy to grab onto it and experiment around that particular element. And so it is, I think it's what makes him particularly appealing to artists from different traditions because of that precise rhythmic pattern that progresses throughout a composition. I mean, you know, there aren't a whole lot of slow downs and, you know, retards where you can just sit and then wait, and then, you know, somebody goes off and flourishes and does a melisma or something vocally and comes back. It actually stays very predictable. And so maybe that may appear to be, for some, the plastic piece, but plastic can be consistent. I don't mean plastic, but the consistency in how you can predict a particular flow of a composition. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
I think that's good.
We're coming up on the hour, and I'm wondering if we need to bring this fascinating conversation to a close. I'm just trying to figure out how the conversation could continue. I guess on the Facebook page, people could be chiming in if you have other thoughts stemming out of this conversation. That would be a way to express them or convey them to Jonathan and to me. So yes, I guess before we leave, do people want to unmute and ask questions out loud, or identify themselves, or say thank you to Jonathan? I guess this would be an opportunity. If you wanted to unmute and speak, then feel free to do so, or if not, just wave and we can bring this to a graceful close. So I'm going to close.
Well, if there are some folks coming in, again, thank you for inviting me to be your guest today. It's really thrilling. And by no means are my sentiments in stone. I've learned to change my mind with new information rather quickly. I practice that. And no one owns the book of definitions on how we interpret what something is. It's free-flowing. And I joke that in some cases, authors of a particular style of music, by the time the general public gives it a name, they moved on to something else.
Right.
So it's a privilege to be able to, in a healthy academic way, talk about music, but there's nothing that can replace performing it, to be engaged in it, to not only be a willing listener who wants to be a student, which I think all musicians should remain in the category of being a student of music, and to never get to that place where we feel like we've progressed to the degree where our status as an expert means that we have all of the answers, because I don't. And I've learned that things change, and my ideas can change and theories can change. But what is consistent is that music is an expression of our humanity. It is that language that we may not understand all of the complexities of the language, but we can tell when it's mournful. We can feel when it's celebratory. We can actually tell in some cases where it feels like joy coming out of it. It feels like there's something familiar about the expression. And that to me is where we all can meet, at that apex on the bridge itself, where there isn't one side or the other. It's at the apex of that bridge.
Human experience. Yay. Well, thank you so much. And I hope I will have an opportunity to have further conversations with you in the future, sir. Thank you all for joining us. And we will have other evening and daytime events. So tomorrow's program is already listed on our website. It'll go live tomorrow at 8. And then tomorrow evening's event is a lovely concert of music for organ and oboe d'amore by Mark Fink, oboe and oboe d'amore, and organist Brooks Bengtson. So hope you can join us for that and for all the other events coming up in the festival. And have a good evening. Bye.